It's no secret that I love me a good giant robot fight. Whether it's with another giant robot or with a monster, they're just awesome.
And so does Studio Trigger, in case it wasn't obvious. A studio I absolutely love for their super stylized look and sharp writing.
And yet, there's that one giant robot show we just couldn't get into from them. Something we totally should have been all over.
But we'll talk about Darling in the Franxx some other time.
Ha! Gotcha, didn't we? Nah, this video's about Gridman.
When it first aired, Gridman underwhelmed a lot of people. And I actually think a fair bit of that criticism is pretty well deserved.
Well, sure. The heroes aren't all that interesting, for the most part. The action's great, but pretty short. And the series leaves a lot of things just open.
The style of the show is as fantastic as ever. But the other aspects are pretty much average at best and mediocre at worst.
Except for one massive detail. One element that grabs the show by the scruff of its neck and drags it, kicking and screaming, to stellar heights. A character who almost single-handedly keeps the show afloat.
The character is none other than the show's villain, Shinjou Akane.
Or as we prefer to call her, the main character of SSSS.Gridman. First of all, yes, you heard that right. Shinjou Akane, not Hibiki Yuta, is the main character of SSSS.Gridman. And it's all accomplished based on how flawlessly they pulled off the angle of the broken antagonist.
What? But the show's called Gridman! How are he and Yuta not the main characters? Well, it's actually pretty simple.
Alright, that's a lie. It's surprisingly complicated, and it comes down to a lot of conflicting information and storytelling mechanics about what types of characters serve what functions. There's the protagonist, the main character, the POV character, the hero. It's a mess, really.
For the sake of this little deep dive, we're going to stick with these basic definitions. The protagonist is the character who's driving the plot by going after the story goal. And, by contrast, the antagonist is getting in the protagonist's way.
The POV character is, well, the character whose eyes we're seeing through, hence POV.
The hero is the character we want to see win. They're the one we're rooting for.
And the main character is the character that goes through the primary character journey. Or put even more simply, it's the character that the story's really about.
And for our first outing of Villains Month, we're gonna see how she manages to actually be that last one.
Of all the characters in the entire series, we spend more time in her head than anyone else's.
She's not the primary POV character or anything. That would be Yuta. But it does show us her point of view a lot, and when it does, it gives us a crystal clear look at her mental headspace. More than any other character, actually.
Because of this, she becomes the character we can understand the most clearly. Well, her and Auntie, but we'll come back to them.
Showing us this stuff at all is a big deal. But showing it to us when the other characters aren't even around is even more telling. Ordinarily, you only get these kinds of moments when the other characters are around to witness it. But with her, we get those moments in her perspective. And it shows us exactly how damaged she is. Which actually brings us to the next point.
They just did a great job of showing exactly how broken Akane is. We don't see what happened to her, obviously, but we can get a pretty good idea.
Her actions in the series are objectively horrible. But when you start to see how the series is building her up, you kind of start to get it.
Whatever personal struggles she went through, it deeply affected her. It led her far astray. And that makes her really sympathetic. But it also does something else.
By showing us that she's broken, and not just evil or a psychopath, it presents us with the idea that something had to, well, break her. After all, something has to be whole before it can be shattered to pieces.
Akane is a girl consumed by loneliness. What led to that loneliness isn't known or honestly all that important. We just know that she's lonely. And how do we know this?
She's pretty much the god of this world. They say it several times. She can make everything pretty much however she wants. And that's reflected in the earliest scenes in the school, where she's the most popular girl on campus and is surrounded by people who adore her.
Later in the series, Akane even confirms to Rika that she was born to be Akane's friend. And while she's totally trying to manipulate her, the funny thing is, it's not exactly a lie. It also explains why she's so obsessive about eradicating anything that dares conflict with her perfect vision of the world.
And why Gridman is such a problem for her. He's getting in the way of that vision, and you can tell how much it's affecting her. The more Gridman fights her, the more obsessed and unhinged she becomes.
But it isn't just that she's becoming more unstable. The way it's shown, you honestly get the impression that she's absolutely desperate to get rid of him.
There's also Alexis to consider, the actual big bad of the series, and an amazingly forgettable one at that.
Yeah, but while he's kind of boring on his own, he's pretty key to Akane's development. He's manipulating her, of course, and while his end goal isn't exactly the most interesting thing ever, if you pay attention to how he speaks to Akane, it's very, very apparent what he's doing to meet his ends. He's pretending to be her friend, her benefactor, but he's also putting her up on this pedestal as the god of this world, which, ironically, just deepens that sense of loneliness. He's feeding her problems so she'll stay damaged and keep working to his benefit.
Everything about this series, everything, revolves around Akane. And that brings us to our next point, the ending.
No, we don't mean that little stinger at the end where the real-world Akane wakes up in her room.
Nah. Though we can probably do a whole video on that by itself.
Probably, but we're talking about the resolution to the main storyline. See, there are a lot of moving parts to this. We're not kidding when we say everything revolves around her. Sure, there's the point about her being the god of this world, but if you're familiar with the original Gridman and pay attention to the exposition throughout the last episode, that's not entirely accurate.
However, the part that makes it instantly clear is actually in the title itself. The quadruple S is an acronym, and a clever reference.
The US adaptation of the original Gridman tokusatsu series was called, and I am not kidding, Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad.
Yeah, it's really silly. Methinks they took notes from a certain band of brothers, but Trigger's version of the acronym stands for something completely different. The last episode reveals that it means Special Signature to Save a Soul.
It definitely makes it pretty clear that the show's about her, because who else's soul could it be referring to?
The other thing to keep in mind is how little the rest of the main cast changes. At all, really. I mean, really. Which characters go through the biggest character arcs?
If you think it's Yuta, then I don't know what to tell you, but we might have a talk after class. In all seriousness, though, we're not gonna say there's no other character development, but when you compare the characters all side by side, it's no contest. Really, there are exactly two characters that just tower over the rest. The first, and most obvious from the start, is Auntie, a character that Akane created.
And the other is Akane herself.
Let's be real here, the resolution of the series isn't the boss battle, though that was pretty epic. The Fixer Beam wasn't even the final nail in the coffin. It was Yuta, Rika, and Shou all reaching out to her, but especially Rika.
We can talk about Rika all day probably, but think about this. Rika is the last voice Akane hears when they're all calling out to her. She's the last person that Akane tells, point blank, why she exists. And what does Rika do?
Well, aside from wrestle with an existential crisis for a little bit, she eventually decides that she is going to be Akane's friend. Not because she was literally born to, but because she wants to. And she's basically the representative of the entire group. Hell, if Rika hadn't been around, this series would probably have ended on a much darker note.
And it all comes back to how effectively they crafted her as a broken antagonist, by showing us exactly how broken she was. They basically gave us a roadmap of her character development.
Akane is a character who had to fall as low as she possibly could, only so that she could rise up beyond her fears of a big, lonely world that didn't care about her. That is the character journey that we're watching unfold throughout the series.
They showed us that by letting us spend more time on her character than pretty much anyone else's, which set her up for a fantastic character arc.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, Yuta trying to regain his memories isn't an arc, it's a plot point.
Rika has a character arc, but it isn't really as deep or personal.
And Shou was mostly there as a misdirect, to make us think the series was your typical tokusatsu show, right up until it becomes obvious that it isn't.
If you're watching the show for a deep character study, then you're going to be disappointed looking at the protagonists, because they're definitely not the ones to look at.
So instead, maybe try rewatching the series and focusing this time on its antagonist, Shinjou Akane, better known as the main character of SSSS.Gridman.
And that's all for this one, everyone!
I can get people being disappointed if they expected a typical super robot tokusatsu show, but I honestly think Gridman just gets better the more I watch it. Thoughts? Leave a comment below and give that like button a zap while you're down there.
Don't forget to subscribe. Also give that bell a ring so you're notified whenever we upload a new video.
This has been a Bulletoon weekend.
I'm Rila, signing off.
I'm Riley, bowing out.
Thanks so much for watching.
Keep up the awesome and
Stay tuned!